My name is Orlando Rivera, and I am looking to explore using barbell velocity to objectively auto-regulate load prescription in powerlifters. Before I get into it, just a little background. Uh, in addition to teaching, I do own a small gym in Stony Point, New York. And I can say, having coached several powerlifters, anecdotally, some of the load prescription methodologies, which I'll be mentioning soon, all of them seem to have merit and all of them have some potential flaws. And my goal for this project is really to just simply add some empirical research to the field that strength and conditioning coaches and sports scientists can use to help validate some of their methodologies that they choose to use with athletes or powerlifters. All right, this is frozen. Come on. Powerlifting is an actual sport which is contested of three separate events: the barbell back squat, barbell bench press, and the barbell deadlift. It is a sport that is contested across the world. There are various federations that put on various championship meets. One of the more well-recognized federations is the International Powerlifting Federations for drug-free and raw powerlifters. The first official American event was put on in 1965 by the AAU. Since 1965, the sport of powerlifting has seen a tremendous increase in the popularity of the sport. One of the federations that I've mentioned is the USAPL. The USAPL put on their first Raw National Championships in 2008 with a total of 89 competitors. Since then, we've seen this increase to most recently 1,372 competitors in 2019. So I think the next question would be, well, how do you win in powerlifting? And you do that by achieving the largest total. Essentially, the way it works, as I said, you have three separate events. You are given three separate attempts for each event. So you get 3 attempts to lift the most weight possible in the barbell back squat, 3 attempts in the barbell bench press, and 3 attempts in the barbell deadlift. The most weight you lift, or the largest load lifted for each separate event, is then combined to achieve a quote-unquote total. The largest total is the winner across various weight divisions, across various classes, male, female, and it's also separated by age. While there is some debate over how a strength and conditioning coach or an athlete can go about achieving the largest total possible, most seem to be in agreement that some form of periodization in a training plan matters. So the definition that the literature puts forth for periodization is simply the planned modulation or manipulation of training variables such as load, sets, reps, rest, modality, frequency, in order to improve performance and prevent or avoid overtraining. And through survey research, we found that most high-level power lifters are utilizing some form of periodization. In 2009, Swinton found that 96% of powerlifters are utilizing periodization, and mostly in agreement with him, Shaw et al. In 2020 found that 88.9% of powerlifters are also utilizing some form of periodization. In agreement with them, the literature seems to largely support the use of periodized programs over non-periodized programs to maximize both strength and hypertrophy. As I've mentioned earlier in the prior slide, there are various ways we can go about manipulating our training plan. However, this project in particular is looking at load manipulation or load prescription. Load is of particular importance because what can happen with an excessive training load, we can experience overtraining and or injury. If the load's too heavy, it's possible for some sort of acute or traumatic injury to happen. If the load's too heavy, you can also go through some type of chronic injury as well. If you look at the opposite end of the spectrum, if a load is too light, you might simply be wasting your time. You're not maximizing your adaptations by using a load that is too light. Right? If you think about it, if you think of the strongest power lifter in the world, if he's training with just an empty barbell every single day, that load is going to be too light for him to maximize his adaptations. And when I'm speaking about adaptations, I'm talking about increasing his strength and or hypertrophy. What we really want to do is we want to be in this yellow zone over here on this graphic where we want to get to our optimal training load to maximize our adaptations. But the question really is, well, how do we get to that optimal training load? What determines that optimal training load? What we know right now is that percentage-based training appears to be the current gold standard for load prescription. And what percentage-based training is, an athlete goes through a 1 repetition maximum testing, and we find the maximum load that that athlete could lift. And with that maximum number, that 1 RM, we start to prescribe training loads as a percentage. So if you see in this chart in the top right-hand corner, this is adapted from Poliquin in 1988. You can see in weeks 1 to 2 of training, he's recommending athletes train somewhere between 70 and 75% for 10 to 12 repetitions, and so on and so forth. You could see that training is a percentage of their 1 RM. And we have found this to promote hormonal, neural, metabolic, and even cardiovascular adaptations in athletes. So while percentage-based training is the current gold standard, there are some inherent concerns when using percentage-based training. I kind of break it down into 2 categories. One is just 1 RM testing. Because 1 RM testing is maximal in nature and we have to find the maximal weight that somebody can lift, there is an increased chance or possibility of injury. In addition to that, 1 RM testing can be incredibly time consuming. Now, despite those concerns, my project looks more at the accuracy of load prescription based on percentage-based training. And this can really lead this has 2 sides to it, where there is some intra-participant concerns and there are inter-participant concerns. From an intra-participant perspective, there's some adaptation variability that exists. We know through research that the rate at which you're adapting today from week 1 to week 2 in a training program can vary dramatically from your adaptations in week 10 to 12 or 10 to 11. And it's hard to actually predict your adaptation rate. And sometimes if you're adapting faster than expected, your percentage-based program may no longer be accurate. From an inter-participant perspective, you can look at it both inter-participant and inter-exercise as well. We have some research, which I'm going to show in my literature review, that there's some performance variability. An endurance athlete may be able to perform more repetitions at 80% of a 1 RM than a strength athlete. Additionally, depending on the exercise, somebody might be able to perform more repetitions at 80% on the squat versus the bench press. So all in all, this really comes down to training with an inappropriate load when you're utilizing a percentage-based method, and with an inappropriate load, there is a greater chance of overtraining and or injury. So while percentage-based training is the current gold standard within the industry, there are other methodologies for which strength and conditioning coaches or athletes prescribe load. It goes beyond the scope of this proposal to really explore all of them, but my study in particular will be highlighting percentage-based training, the use of velocity to auto-regulate training and prescribe load, and the use of a repetitions in reserve based rate of perceived exertion to prescribed load. A little load prescription history. I wanted to go back to DeLorme in 1945 because, in my opinion, most of the load prescription models, methodologies, and even periodized programs are really based in DeLorme's findings, and where he challenged at the time the prevalent model for rehabilitation was that we should slowly build up athletes to return to action through more endurance-oriented models. Reps of 20 repetitions, reps of 25 repetitions, which makes sense because weights are lighter and they had just been injured. But DeLorme found that power and strength return faster with heavy resistance and low repetitions exercise. And this became known as progressive resistance exercise or progressive overload. And a lot of these subsequent models or methodologies are really based in that principle where we have to overload progressively the resistance to build strength. Stone in 1981 created a linear periodized model, and he's some of the first research out there to actually support the use of periodization models when working with athletes. And then taking it a step further, in 1988, Poliquin was one of the first publications to prescribe exact training percentages, which I put forth on the slide earlier. Interparticipant and exercise variability. This slide is of particular importance, which highlights some of the potential issues with percentage-based training. In 1987, Hosier et al. Looked to explore 38 untrained males using different exercises. So essentially, they performed 7 different exercises. The most notable ones that are comparable to powerlifting are the bench press and the leg press. They did this at different percentages, 40, 60, and 80% of a 1RM. And what you could see in the major findings column is that at 60% of a 1RM, the leg press and the bench press repetitions until failure. So the most repetitions they could do at 60% of their 1RM differ dramatically. Where the leg press, the males were able to perform almost 34 repetitions, but on the bench press, they were only able to perform 19.7. As we move it further, there still are significant differences where at 80% of the 1RM on the leg press, they were able to perform 15 repetitions, but on the bench press, once again, they were only able to perform 9.8 repetitions. So this starts to highlight that percentages should probably not be prescribed broadly across different exercises. Looking at different populations, Reichens et al. In 2014 looked at some strength athletes versus some endurance athletes. And the findings were sort of what you would expect in that the endurance athletes on average were able to perform more repetitions until failure. So if you look at 80% of the 1RM, the endurance athletes were able to perform 19.8 repetitions versus 11.8 for the strength athletes. This is important because we don't know while somebody may compete in a sport like strength training, we don't know if they are a strength or power dominant athlete. They might be competing in a sport like powerlifting or weightlifting, but they might have a background in endurance training, or maybe genetically speaking, they're more meant for an endurance-oriented world. So once again, prescribing load based on their a blind percentage might not really be the best thing. And then Hubble et al. In 2005 really highlights some importance of percentage-based training and really adaptation variability. This study looked at 585 males and females, and all of these participants went through the exact same 12-week progressive resistance exercise program studying the bicep curl. And some of the major findings in this study are that hypertrophy, right? Hypertrophy on the training arm, right? Some participants improved or increased muscular hypertrophy by 50%. However, some of the participants, right, the bottom end range of that was 0% improvement. In fact, they didn't grow any muscle at all after training for 12 weeks. And similarly, along these lines, strength was improved in one participant up to 250%. And once again, at the bottom end of that range, there was 0 improvement for one of the participants. So to have a 0 to 250% improvement range in strength is an incredible number. And I think this really comes down to applying these programs based on a little bit more of a broad-ranging program and not applying them individually to your participants. So now we're looking a little bit about autoregulation. Up to this point, I haven't spoke to what autoregulation is, so I think at this point a definition is important. Autoregulation can be defined as adjusting daily training parameters based on an athlete or person's current readiness. So essentially, our readiness can vary because of a variety of factors, whether we didn't sleep the night before, whether we didn't eat much the day before, whether we have a lot of life stress going on. This can and will affect our training ability. So what autoregulation does, instead of applying a training percentages and you go just do your training percentage, it provides a more flexible model of loading. And there are various autoregulatory programs, one of which is RPE. So Knight really was the first to explore one form of autoregulation. And his study aside, I think he had an interesting quote really describing other training programs, specifically percentage-based programs. They all suffer from a common weakness. They provide no way to determine whether or not the patient is working at his maximal level. So that comes back to some of those potential flaws where if we provide 70% and it's a load that is too light, we don't know if it's too light, right? So that's really what RPE kind of comes into play. Knight's model was originally used for rehabilitation. However, it was adapted by Mel Siff and later tested empirically by Mann in 2010 on 23 D1 football players. And this autoregulatory program called APRI was found to be significantly better across all measures of strength in the squat, bench press, and the bench press for endurance, which was essentially performing 225 pounds for max repetitions. Another autoregulatory model utilizing RPE, rating of perceived exertion, was studied by Helms et al. In 2018. And he worked with 21 experienced athletes, and they trained for 3 times a week for 8 weeks and looked at strength and strength on the squat and the bench press. And while he did not find significant differences using a percentage-based model versus an RPE-based model, he did find that there was effect sizes slightly favoring the RPE autoregulatory model. And I think the Helm study is particularly important because not only because he's on my committee, but I'm really modeling that 8-week program. I'm utilizing that 8-week program that he used in his study in mind with velocity, RPE, and percentage. And finally, velocity-based training history. Gonzalez and Badillo were the first in 2010 to find that there was a strong inverse correlation between velocity and relative load. So what essentially that means, as velocity decreases, load increases, or more importantly, as you add more weight to the bar, typically the bar moves slower. And this was important because we found that velocity can be used as a proxy for load. And then jumping forward to 2019, Durrell was the first one to use a velocity-based load prescription methodology in a longitudinal design, comparing it to a percentage-based program, just like I plan on doing. However, he used it with 27 rugby players. And while he didn't find significant improvement in strength, he did find that mean velocity, and mean power were higher with velocity-based training. And then more importantly, he actually found that there was a lower time under tension and a lower perceived stress using velocity, which can definitely be important when kind of determining an athlete's readiness. Similarly, in 2020, Durrell et al. Looked at velocity versus percentage-based training in 16 resistance-trained males. He looked at a few more lifts. He looked at the back squat, the bench press, the deadlift, and the overhead press. And he did find significant improvements in 2 of the 4 lifts contested with velocity-based training, favoring velocity-based training. Moving on to a little bit of theory. Before I speak to the theory that I've chosen to use, I think this picture aptly sums up my general view or disposition towards the current stance in strength and conditioning. And really, so the expression is you can't see the forest for the trees. And I think, in my opinion, some of the field within sports science, strength and conditioning coaches and athletes is that we've become so enamored and so obsessed with finding the fine details of performance that we unfortunately forget that the goal is, at the end of the day, performance. The goal is whole body adaptation. And in the case of powerlifting, whole body adaptation is getting stronger, lifting more weight. So if we're doing studies and we're trying to find details, maybe like changes or improvements at the molecular level, maybe they don't lead to whole body adaptation improvements, or more specifically to our field, maybe we don't need to be as quite obsessive as, well, do we need to do 5 sets versus 4 sets? Does it make a significant difference? And I think that's where we've become so reductionist in our approach, where I think we have to slightly take a step back. So moving forward, general systems theory was put forth by Ludwig von Bertalanffy in 1972. He has 4 principles for general systems theory, which can be really displayed or utilized within a sports science background. Nonlinear effects were explored by Paul in 2019, where he looked at injury. And simply put, with regards to injury, that states that a change in variable x can lead to a proportional or non-proportional change in variable y. When looking at injuries, the best way to sum that up is you can do something 1,000 times. You could squat 200 pounds 1,000 times, but on that 1,001th time, it may lead to an injury because injuries are multifactorial or non-linear. Epigenetics or circular causality can be described by using epigenetics. Circular causality states that things can happen from a top-down or bottoms-up approach, and epigenetics are an example. Our DNA largely is determined by our family, right? Our parents. However, the expression of our DNA can be altered by things like our lifestyle, our activity. So the actual expression is really what we would consider a bottoms-up approach, while where we inherit our genetics from a top-down approach. And lastly, multifinality and equifinality. An example of multifinality, or what multifinality states, is that the same path can lead to multiple or different outcomes. And the best example, I've already spoke of that, is the Hubble study, where he had 585 participants follow the same training program or the same path, and it led to a vast array of outcomes. And equifinality conversely states that different paths can lead to the same outcomes. And this is really an example of this would be the various methodologies. The best example would be Helm's study in 2018, where he looked at 2 different training methodologies or loading methodologies, RPE and PBT, and there was a non-significant difference in the findings. Both led to strength improvements. As far as my conceptual model goes, I have 2 that I've utilized for us to view general systems theory. One is the biopsychosocial model of health, put forth by George Engel in 1977. And in 1977, the predominant model was the biomedical model. And Engel argued that the biomedical model was a reductionist approach because the fields of medicine at the time felt that everything can be reduced down to the biological level, the molecular level, and you could explain every disease state at the molecular level. However, this largely disregarded the psychosocial elements of health. So psychiatry at the time wasn't really included in the biomedical model of health. And I took a quote from his paper where he wrote, "Health and sickness are diffused by cultural, social, and psychological considerations." And one example he utilizes is grief. Grief, while difficult to explain at the biological level, can produce physiological disease states. Another conceptual model which utilizes the general systems theory approach is Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome. Hans Selye in the 1950s stated that our body reacts to all sorts of stressors. This could be anything as far as heat, cold, it could be life stress, or as the sports science world has utilized his model, it can be some sort of training load or volume, right? That is a stressor as well. And all of these things can be stressors which contribute to the 3 stages of adaptation. The alarm stage, which is where we first experience these stressors. The resistance stage, which is really supercompensation. Our body adapts to these stressors once they're removed. And if they're not removed, we go through exhaustion. As a sports scientist or a sports coach, you really want to try to account for the stressors, the various stressors, as well as possible. And this is where autoregulation really applies, because a percentage-based training program, the PBT model, doesn't really account for many external stressors. It can't. It's a prefixed model. The autoregulatory models like RPE and VBT are a more flexible model of training where if somebody has a lot of external stressors going on and they're unable to perform, we can modify load based on those stressors. So this is just a little depiction, kind of bridging theory and application. As I've said, I think the field has become a little reductionist in our approach, and we need to slowly take that step back. Galen is one of the first to put forth a periodization model or any type of training concepts. Matveyev put forth the first real periodization model. Then we looked into various periodization models, whether it was undulating or linear. Then we decided, okay, we need to figure out, well, how many sets and repetitions are the best. Now we're looking at load prescription models like I am. We need to make sure that we are looking at whole body adaptation because at the end of the day, that's what we're all about, performance. So just to kind of wrap up our knowns versus our unknowns, we know research largely supports periodized program. Periodization is involving the manipulation of load, sets, and reps. Load prescription is particularly important for maximum strength and hypertrophy. Various loading methodologies exist, which I've already spoken about. Currently, PBT appears to be the conventional or gold standard methodology used. And we also know that the adaptive process is highly variable. What we don't know is, do set time frames exist for adaptation? It appears they might not. Are we over or under prescribing load using the PBT model based on 1RMs? And is there a best methodology to individualize training? My research questions, I'll move quickly through those, but essentially I'm looking to explore if velocity-based VBT load prescription is a viable alternative to a PBT methodology in producing strength gains. Similarly, is VBT a viable alternative to PBT in producing hypertrophic gains? I'm also going to be comparing VBT to RPE for strength and hypertrophy. I'll also be looking at the use of VBT compared to PBT at perceived stress and perceived recovery status. And then lastly, Is velocity-based load prescription a viable alternative to PBT at reducing that inter-individual adaptive variability? As far as my design goes, I'm looking at a quantitative longitudinal randomized control study. This is going to be a pre-test, post-test with an 8-week intervention. The intervention is going to be the loading methodology, PBT, RPE, and VBT. My participants, to be included in this study, they have to have a minimum of 2 years training experience, have competed within the USAPL or USPA within the last 5 years, and greater than 17 years of age and free from injury. Exclusion criteria is the use of anabolic steroids in the past, or they cannot plan to compete during the duration of this training program or intervention. I'll be using convenient purposive sampling, where I'm going to go to local powerlifting gyms, SMG Powerlifting, Mount Vernon Barbell, and Multisport Workshop. I'll speak to owners and post flyers, and I'll also be utilizing or encouraging snowball sampling for participants, family, friends, and social media. My power analysis. So I ran an a priori power analysis and looking for a power of 0.95. I put input variables from this Zerdos study in 2015, where he looked at similar variables for strength, where his primary dependent measure was strength. And I found a target sample of 42 really appeared to be the number I'm targeting. This gave me an effect size that we would really look for, which is anything above 0.5. If you look at the columns on the left, this is effect size. The only column that was not a medium or moderate effect was this 1 RM bench, and the sample size was 456. And essentially, as effect size decreases, the sample size increases. So because the effect size isn't something I would be looking for, this sample size was thrown away. Using a 15% attrition rate, I came to a target sample size of 48.3. So my variables that I'm looking at for my independent variables, I've got loading methodology as one, and there's 3 different loading methodologies: PBT, RPE, and VBT. Another independent variable is time, and that's going to be my pre to post testing. My pre to post testing is going to be for strength and hypertrophy, which are my primary dependent measures. As I already said, I'm also going to be looking at perceived recovery status, perceived stress, and variability of adaptations. So I think it's important that I explain this flow chart a little bit. Once I receive IRB approval and I go through participant recruitment, I get informed consent. Participants will go through a pre-testing protocol with me. During the pre-testing protocol, they will be doing 1 RM testing for the main lifts and power lifts, which are the back squat, the bench press, and the deadlift. From there, the participants will be assigned to one of 3 protocols: the RPE, the VBT, or the PBT protocol, and they will follow this for 8 weeks. They are not going to do all 3 protocols, so they're going to follow the RPE loading methodology for 8 weeks. Or if they're assigned VBT, they'll go through the 8 weeks of VBT loading methodology. They will be, once they're done with their 8-week training program, they will come back for a post-test, and then we'll go through data analysis. On the left here is a picture of a Vitruvi linear encoder. This is how we measure barbell velocity. This little piece here is attached to a barbell, and the piece of equipment measures displacement and time, and with displacement and time we could determine barbell velocity. The chart on the right is an RPE chart adapted from Zerdos in 2016, and participants would be using this for the RPE based training methodology. This is an example adapted from Helm's 2017 paper. of the 8-week loading methodology for PBT and RPE training plans. And then I took it one step further and I adapted it utilizing velocity. This is an example of the perceived recovery status form, or scale rather. Participants are going to fill this scale out every day before training. They'll rate it 0 to 10, 10 being very well recovered, ready to perform, and 0 being very poorly recovered and they're expecting a decline in performance. This is an example of the DALDA adapted from Rushal in 1990. Participants also are going to fill this out before every single session. They'll fill out A, B, C for all of these categories, A being worse than normal, B being normal, and C being better than normal. And my data analysis. So I'm going to be doing a within group and a between group analysis. My within group is simply to look at whether or not the group improved pre to post. So whether or not VBT improved pre to post on strength and or hypertrophy. And I'm going to be using a dependent or paired t-test for that for all 3 groups, VBT, PBT, RPE. And then more importantly, I'm going to be doing a between group analysis. This is going to be a 3x2 factorial analysis of variance or ANOVA. I have 2 independent variables. The first being loading methodology. That's where the 3 comes in. And I have 3 different loading methodologies, PBT, RPE, and VBT. And then the 2 in the factorial analysis of variance is time, pre and post. This is going to be done for 2 different variables, my 2 dependent variables, strength and hypertrophy, with an alpha being set at 0.05. I'm also going to be looking at effect size, which is essentially the meaningfulness of the results, not whether or not just it was significant. I need to know how meaningful the result actually was. I'm going to be using a Hopkins scale to determine how meaningful it was, which with scores of 0.2, 0.6, 1.2, and 2 denoting smallest worthwhile effect, a moderate effect, a large effect, or a very large effect. I do have a question about this actually. Some secondary variables that I'm looking for are between group differences in total training volume, weekly training volume, relative load volume, relative intensity per repetition, DALDA scores, and PRS scores. And for these, I'm going to also be doing a factorial ANOVA because I'm going to be comparing them pre to post and on a weekly basis. So I'm going to do a 3x8 here where I am looking at loading methodology, which is my 3, and the 8 is my weeks 1 through 8. If there are significant differences detected, post hoc, I'm going to have to do a Tukey post hoc analysis for either the 3x2 or the 3x8 if differences are detected to determine where the significant differences occurred. For intersubject variability, I'm going to be looking at range and standard deviation. So is there a large range in terms of the outcomes of the participants? Did one participant in the PBT group improve not at all, and another participant in the PBT group improved by 20 pounds or 30 pounds in the bench press? If there's a larger range, that implies that there may be larger variability. Additionally, a standard deviation, a larger standard deviation, which is the spread of scores away from the mean, improves that there might be a larger intersubject variability. And I'm looking to see if loading methodologies can reduce this variability in powerlifters. So to wrap it up, periodization is largely supported to improve strength and hypertrophy. Loading methodology is one very important subcomponent of periodization. PBT is the current gold standard methodology. However, there are some inherent problems with PBT and the accuracy of which it's loading. And I'd like to see if VBT may serve as a viable alternative for auto-regulating load prescription, thus reducing variability and/or maximizing strength and hypertrophy. Thank you.